little detour that I think is still very relevant, which is around that introduction, around the disabled person that you had invited not being able to make it, and the kind of the requirements for their presence not having been met. And I think this is a really, really important point, and thank you so much for the openness about this, because it really kind of starts this question around how could we design climate policies and climate practices that are inclusive when some of the people cannot even be there, cannot even participate in that process, right? So it's really, it's really an invitation to the jury to really think about who is not there, who may actually have to participate in that process of making climate policies fair, and in what way could different people be affected potentially very differently from various climate policies. And I think disabled people is really kind of an interesting and important example. And obviously this is a very big and diverse group. It's by no means a rare experience, the disabled experience. I think in Europe, it's about 1 in 5 people that are classified as disabled. But there's also a lot of common trends. And they may usually be lower incomes or less access to various, kind of primary services. And when we think about energy and carbon, they might actually be very different needs there. So, for example, a disabled person may require an access to car, as in the example that was given earlier today. And it's not really by choice, right? It's not that you choose not to take a bus. It may be that the buses are not really enabling people to access them, people with, for example, mobility impairment. Or it may not be an option to walk, right? So in terms of environmental implications, we may advise for active travel, so more walking and more biking, or we may advise for better public transport, but not everyone would have the same ability to use those. So it's really important when we think about designing environmental policy to think about also options for people that may not be able to engage with those policies. What would be their solution, and how do we design it in a way that it is truly inclusive? And a huge step in that is really opening up that design discussion and including people with various experiences, because we really need to learn from each other's experiences and from each other's struggles in that design. So this was, just a little bit of spontaneous introduction. The other thing that I wanted to make as a point was that a lot of our slides, and a lot of our discussions focus on consumption footprints, so the carbon footprints that Mike also defined, which really links to a consumer, right? The purchases, our own purchases, whether it is to power our home, so whether it is the clothes that we buy or the cars that we drive or whatever. And this is a really, really key element. I really don't want to kind of reduce its importance. Like, consumption is very, very important, but it's also important to think about it in big open ways. So how infrastructures, for example, the city infrastructures, those would have huge implications for consumption practices. So a city that, that allows for green commute, for a commute where people could get around very easily, in very connected ways without using transport modes, for example, that are associated with huge emissions. This really may be a decision that is made locally or on a city level, and it's not necessarily, and it's not only about an individual designing, for example, to not opt for a car, to opt for a bus. So it's really important to think about this, again, in the design of policies. What are various actors that have a role? And obviously we all have individual responsibilities as consumers, but also what are our responsibilities, for example, in our workplaces, or what is the responsibility that lies with the local council or with national authorities and all of that, and to hold each other accountable. That is really important to really get to the kind of emission reductions that we really need to get to. Okay, and on that note, I think I'm ready to go to my actual slides. Okay, so this, so here really wanted to show that, okay, that average picture that Mike presented on the UK carbon footprint for the Preston case is really not that different. So we're looking at emissions at a very, very similar level. So very, very similar footprints in terms of the Preston average and the UK average, and how that footprint is distributed across different consumption categories is also very similar. So the same shares of food, of travel, of shelter, and other consumption are there. Next slide, please. And this is just to kind of give you a sense of how emissions have been developing over time. Again, Preston and the UK share very, very similar trends. And, you know, luckily, or fortunately, we see reduction in these consumption footprints over time. And this has primarily been due to changes in the energy mix of the UK and the domestic energy mix, but you know, in some ways, it's in the right direction, right? Like they're falling down, and the same actually is the case for the emissions that are happening on the for the territorial emissions, on the emissions that are happening on UK territory. So both on the consumption side and the production side, we see reductions. Next slide, please. And again, so Mike already mentioned there's huge differences in terms of what, you know, how people of various incomes may contribute to in terms of emissions. So people of lower incomes contribute to lower carbon footprint, so lower emissions associated with their purchases, and people with higher incomes have higher emissions associated with their purchases. And it's really quite a striking difference. And there's a lot of things that determines one's footprint. So it's not only income, but sorry? Okay.
Carry on.
Yeah. So knowing someone's income, actually, this is a really, really good explanatory factor for their footprint. So if you know someone's income, you could pretty much tell their footprint. So it's really like the thing that has the main driving power, and you see huge discrepancies across income. Okay, last slide. And then in just in terms of which are the different categories that drive this. So again, flights were mentioned. So aviation is really the sector where there's the biggest discrepancy between the lowest 10% income and the highest 10% income. So over 6 times is the higher, the footprint of aviation is over 6 times higher for the highest 10% income group compared to the lowest one. While other categories that are much more basic, like food, like shelter, we see those to be much more equally distributed. So again, this is a huge thing that we need to consider in the context of environmental policy. So if we were to, you know, put most of the kind of burden, the policy burden on shelter and food, that those policies would be disproportionately carried by low-income people. If we put more of the policy burden on aviation, for example, then it would be frequent wealthy flyers that tend to carry the cost associated with that environmental policy. So this is, again, something that is really, really important for fair and inclusive climate policy. Thank you.